Welcome to all of our attendees. I'm just going to go over some quick housekeeping and then we'll get into our discussion, inshallah. So the way this is going to work is we're going to have, we have a set of questions that Bahrat and I have prepared based around the book that Asim Qureshi and our guest Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan contributed to and curated. We will be going through those questions during this panel, but we also invite the audience to send in any questions that they have related to surveillance, political activism, engagement with state actors, etc. And we'll try to incorporate those questions into our discussion, or at least get to them at the end of our discussion. So I hope that works for everyone. This is streaming live on Facebook and it's being recorded as well. So if you missed it live, you can definitely watch it at a later date on our YouTube channel. So with that, my name is Iman Abbasi. I am the co-founder and one of the board of trustees of Traversing Tradition. Joining me today is Bahrat Sayal. He is one of our writers and he's on our staff. And I also have the pleasure of introducing our guest, Dr. Asim Qureshi, who is the research director of UK Cage. And he's also edited an anthology called I Refuse to Condemn, to which our next guest, Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, has contributed. She is an educator, a poet, and also an author of a book called Postcolonial Banter. So thank you so much, guys, for joining us. We were just chatting earlier about how quarantine has affected all of our lives. I'm not sure if this was a quarantine project, but certainly lots of wonderful things coming out of this time as well. So alhamdulillah, Asim sent me the book a few weeks ago and I had the chance to read it. And I guess one of the things that struck me was, certainly I've had some experience in activism and organizing spaces. I have a professional and academic background in human rights. So a lot of the things that were written in this book resonated with me. At the same time, there were some disagreements that I had as well. And I'm hoping that, through the course of this conversation, we can kind of unpack those and show how, even amongst people who believe that things like Islamophobia are a legitimate problem, there are still disagreements about how we should best approach our activism or our spirituality in this sense. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is an essay that I really enjoyed. And that was Shireen Fernandez's essay. She writes, or she recounts the story about how she presented her research topic in front of her IRB committee, or her university's ethics committee, to get approval for her research study. And one of the things that she was, the thing that she was aiming to discover was, the effect of prevent on Muslim parents and teachers. And an ask that the panel made of her, this ethics committee made of her, was that if she deemed that any Muslim child that she interviewed as part of this research study was at risk for radicalization, that she would be required to report them to prevent. And so she reflects upon how very quickly this research study that was aiming to kind of understand the impact of prevent on the lives of Muslim parents and children and teachers, how quickly she became part of that state apparatus. She became an extension of the very policy that she was trying to research and show the detrimental effects of. And so she, writes how uncomfortable that was for her and how it was a non-starter, right? It was completely non-negotiable for her to kind of give over Muslim children in this way. So I'm wondering, along those lines, what are some other red lines that exist in your lives that would be a complete non-starter for you, whether that's in your academic work, your professional work, or even in your private lives? And this is open, so please feel free to jump in, anyone who has thoughts.
Oh, it's a big question, but I guess I've been thinking about this today myself, actually, funnily enough. And the reason is, I guess, in the UK, and I suppose this is in other countries too, the Home Office, which is obviously where policing, whether that's border policing or policing through normal police or counter-terror policing, is all housed. And one of the things we've seen over the last decade is that through austerity and like cuts from the government to public institutions, there's been a removal of funds in general, but then a kind of opening of all these funding pots that come through counter-terror and counter-extremism pots. And something that's kind of led to is that lots of institutions, so as a poet, I kind of get involved with lots of different art and literature events, but lots of these organizations and events now tend to be actually funded. If you trace that funding back, it's coming from the Home Office. And for me, this becomes a really tricky issue, because I see one of my red lines to be, I don't want to be complicit in that apparatus that is criminalizing not just my community, but multiple marginalized communities. It's detaining people at the border, deporting people. And so that it becomes a really hard red line to actually navigate, because so many places and spaces are co-opted into that, as well as also kind of not necessarily unknowingly, but I suppose naively as well. There are many who are kind of within this machine. And so that's just one, I guess, that comes off the top of my head, is like not being willing or kind of able to work with anything that's funded from that specific department of government. Yeah, Asim, I'll throw it to you to give another one.
It's okay. I mean, look, ultimately, what we're talking about when we're talking about red lines is we're talking about our ethics. And, the starting place for any discussion about ethics as Muslims, and we're all speaking as Muslims here, we don't secularize our faith from the world that we live in, is, ultimately, the first point of any call is shirk, making sure that whatever we do does not cross into the realm of associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any way, shape, form, or manner. And part of that is ensuring that we do not normalize anything that has been established as a had by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran or through the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? These are like huge red lines for us. I think sometimes people forget that, because we live in a world that's full of so much violence, and that violence is so visceral that we forget that this matters as a matter of spirituality, matters in terms of everything that we then go on to do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set boundaries for things, and we have to keep within those boundaries. Now, within that, and this is for me is like one of my favorite hadith Qudsis is the one where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I have forbidden oppression upon myself. Like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could oppress us as much as he possibly wants, and it would still not be an injustice, because he has given us life, because he has given us everything that we have. But he subhanahu wa ta'ala, he chooses to say to us, to tell us, to remind us that I have forbidden oppression upon myself. Okay, and then I've forbidden oppression upon you too. So he's setting the standard for how we interact with him and with the world around us. And so, from that, I take this notion of within my, what I feel is my rizq, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to me, which is to understand the violence of this world, to understand the oppression that's taking place, and to then respond to that as my personal responsibility in my life to ensure that I try and minimize oppression as much as I possibly can, and that is connected to these red lines that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has established in so many different areas of our lives. And oppression is one of those areas, and how oppression manifests itself. And so, yeah, that's how I try and, rather than thinking about it in terms of specifics, because there are many specificities that we could go through, whether it's Zionism or capitalism or wherever it might be, right? Like the kinds of things that cause harm to other people, to first start off from the perspective of, okay, is what is happening connected to something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us is a problem? So yeah, inshallah, maybe I don't know if that's too vague for you guys, but it's just how I tend to think about these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we will be continuously referencing throughout this discussion. It's how important it is to stay rooted in a sense of Islamic ethics, right? And really using that as a foundation for all of the work that we do. Something that was really curious to me about her story as well, and I'm sure this is true for many of us, is how this type of these asks that are made of us, right? That seem so subtle, so innocuous, that come from places like the ethics committee, which you would think by nature of its name is ethical, right, is concerned with ethics, how these things are, you know, far more subtle and far more real in a sense, or far more tangible than the type of Islamophobia that is experienced in other parts of the world, right? So what China is doing with the Uyghur population, or what France, currently what Macron is saying in France, these are like civilizational battlefronts, right, that they're waging against Islam. But for many people, maybe in the Anglosphere, maybe in the US and the UK, they won't be put into concentration camps. But there are these like very subtle Islamophobic asks that are made of us that do have tangible impacts on our lives. And we often, gloss over them. So I thought, it was important to kind of be mindful of that it's not always like these huge events, but also these subtle events that take place. And then also how they kind of impact our production of knowledge. So because this was a non-starter for Shireen, she didn't go through with that research study. And so she wasn't able to evaluate how things like prevent affected Muslim parents and children and teachers. So just like how that affects our knowledge production as well, I think is really important for us to be mindful of. Bharat, if you want to ask the next question.
Yeah. Well, sorry, can I just say about that?
Of course.
Quickly, if you don't mind. Which is, in my work, it's so important for me dealing with lots of different trauma survivors to not introduce a sliding scale of oppression. And this again comes from, in my mind at least, from a very Quranic sentiment, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who sets the terms for what we consider difficulty in our lives. We don't set that. You will not be burdened with more than you can bear. And I remember sitting with a detainee once who had been detained for 13 years, the vast majority of it in isolation, and him crying to me in front of me, saying that maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't consider him worthy of a harder test than the ones that the brothers in Guantanamo went through, because he never experienced the kind of torture that they did. He goes, maybe I was weaker in my iman. And I just remember like just feeling broken listening to this man speak about the appalling oppression that he had been through, something that I don't know if I would ever be able to handle in my own life. And it just reminded me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us what we have. And when we establish these kinds of like markers, like that's torture, that's like so much worse than anything that we could ever possibly imagine. This is what's happening to children. This is what kind of rape is like. These are all important things. And of course, we should never be neglectful of the fact that there are certain types of violences that are worse than others. But when we're dealing with an individual who has a problem in their life, like part of empathy and part of our responsibility to them is not to minimize the impact that might be having on them, because you don't see sometimes what's going on in the inside. You don't see the fears that they have, the anxieties that they have, how they've constructed a world for themselves. A border stop for somebody could be the most devastating thing that's ever happened in their life, and it could impact them in a very real way on a daily basis. Whereas for somebody else, you just like, oh, got stopped again at the airport, right? Like it has an impact in different ways. And so, yeah, I think it's just important that we don't relativize the kinds of trauma that Muslims go through around the world. Otherwise, again, we get into this like kind of really weird space of like, this is real oppression and this isn't, I think it's just, it all really depends on how we internalize these things as individuals, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to test us through these moments. Sorry, I just wanted to add.
Can I add to that as well? I just wanted to add that I guess another caution maybe that I try to think about is also not setting up that binary, I suppose, that is set by the West itself, that kind of we are there won't be concentration camps in the US and in Britain, when actually there are. If you're an undocumented person, if you're an asylum seeker and you're detained at the border indefinitely, I mean, I kind of think like we kind of shouldn't apply these. We're often applying maybe perhaps what's our experience as maybe like proper citizens of a certain demographic. And I think actually there are people who experience British law and British legislation in a way that actually is extremely violating and actually does remove all of those human rights that I think we kind of attribute to like the West. And so I just think we should also be careful to not almost regurgitate that narrative of the British state and the US state, which I suppose would say there's never going to be concentration camps here, whilst there are people indefinitely detained for up to 30 years. And like, there's, yeah, I think, yeah.
I think to add to that, actually, what you said, Asim, really struck a chord with me as well. I mean, so while I work in criminal defence now, before when I worked at a legal aid firm, I did a bit of prison law, and some of the clients there were Muslims, Muslim women, Muslim men, from Category A prisons to Category C prisons, and I think the individual approach you kind of have to mold yourself into when speaking with clients will always be important. I do think it's a good standard to have in society as well, actually, when talking about a range of these issues. Something you said, Suhaiymah, earlier about the way people may feel profiled by the police, for example. In this country, we have a lot of recent examples of the Metropolitan Police making violations against people's individual rights. The firm I work with currently, while I can't talk about the details of the case as it's ongoing, there is an article in the Guardian about the person that involves and how he experienced, brutalization at the hands of the Metropolitan Police. How there wasn't really a cover up, but it's how police officers in the moment might refer to, the various codes of PACE in terms of the reasons for the arrest, the reasons for reasonable force. How in the moment, even if they're in a public place, it can just be kind of glossed over. And this chap, he experienced a lot of bruising to his chest, for example, as a result of the arrest, which seemed to be, as we now know, as almost an unreasonable use of force in a way. Likewise with prison clients, I mean, it's a really specific area of prison law, but when people are scheduled for an executive release or for an ongoing release, the influence of kind of the bureaucratic mechanisms, I suppose, of representatives of the Secretary of State in assessing, someone's risk to the public, especially when it concerns a Muslim detainee. The standards that can be set sometimes, the defensiveness that you can see from representatives on behalf of the Secretary of State can be a little bit more pronounced in a number of ways. It's almost as though the categories of risk that they look out for beyond the norms, whether that relates to a previous offence or whether it doesn't, there do seem to be strange standards, is a word I want to use, that can be put on certain kinds of detainees, especially Muslim ones. And even likewise on the other side, I worked in a human rights case about a year and a half ago, and it involved a Muslim woman detained in a Cat B. She, imagined the lifestyle this way. She was convicted, owned up for it, but she wasn't allowed to leave her shoes outside of her cell, for example. She kept on requesting to officers, I have to do that if I'm going to pray my salah. I have to do that if I want to read in the way that I want to, if I want to recite. The direction of the Qibla from her cell would have been in line with the toilet in there. Things like that. When you try and make representations for that to be changed or to argue against that, putting forward on behalf of them, it either can be shot down, it can be ignored. You might refer to human rights legislation to try and defend them, but oftentimes you're met with, at least in my experience, you're met with a lot of resistance, maybe a bullying attitude. So I don't know if that's been your experience with American prisons as well, Asim. I think it's an interesting.
Both UK and America, everything that you've described is something that I've heard from UK prisoners at various points, and it's prisoners. It's interesting actually when we think about kind of certain Islamic ethics around how prisoners were dealt with in the past, right? Which is the punishment was the punishment that was given for a specific crime. All of this extra stuff that comes with the dehumanization, this is added punishment, which shara'an is not permissible. The way in which we treat prisoners once they're inside prison, in and of itself is a huge problem within society, within all societies, any societies that runs prison systems. They think that these people have no more rights because they've been in prison. The very notion of the imprisonment in the first place is the punishment. Everything else is what we would term ultra vires. It goes beyond the power of what is permitted. To slap somebody, to slap a prisoner, to slap a detainee, right, is then going beyond what was permitted in the first place. Now you've committed an act of oppression against somebody that has been housed outside of the rest of society for a very, very, very specific reason, which is why just even contemporary notions of imprisonment are so problematic for us, because it comes with a level of dehumanization that unfortunately kind of reproduces other forms of harm in the long term, I think.
And it's also bound up with capitalism in a specific way, right? Where you've got private corporations profiting massively off prison, which is just something that's not, that's not even within the realm of, I think, what the idea would have been.
Definitely. No, definitely. I think, sort of in line with what you said, well, both of you, Asim and Suhaiymah, have been saying about, a place of empathy needing to have a place, I think, in how we discuss, things like this, individuals, on the topic of prisoners and how Muslims are perceived more generally. I think, I was reading through a few sort of articles following the Court of Appeal decision in Shamima Begum's case linked to her citizenship. And I mean, I assume you're probably more than updated and appraised on outcomes and the judgment and things like that. But, I do think her case ties into this in a number of ways. For example, I mean, the Special Immigration Appeals Commission, which was the parliamentary body that had to independently review, while they acknowledged, she was a victim of grooming in the past, the Court of Appeal, their judgment noted issues of fairness in her not being able to be there, for example, despite having representation. And it's kind of led to a lot of people observing whether the Special Immigration Appeals Commission acted in the fairest of ways it could have, and whether or not they acted to kind of rubber stamp the Home Office's CE agenda. I think I wanted to get your thoughts on that sort of broadly, and then I've got some specific questions afterwards. I mean, so how true do you think that is in terms of parliamentary independent bodies acting in a way that kind of contravenes their supposed independence?
I mean, I think we're quite used to it now. I think that's pretty much par for the course in terms of how we're dealt with. Look, just take just for example the number of people have had their citizenships revoked. Right, we're talking in the hundreds now. We don't know the exact number because it's very difficult to get that, but at least there are over 100. Out of, let's say, 100, only one is a non-Muslim, which is Anna Chapman, who was accused of being a Russian spy. Everyone else is a Muslim. And this idea that's built into this legislation in the first place, that coupled with our existence, and this includes fourth generation British born Muslims, right? Coupled with our existence is this notion that we have this connectivity to elsewhere constantly. No matter what you do, no matter how well established you are generationally in the UK, there's something always else going on. And with Shamima's case in particular, right, it's so interesting because we end up, at least the state ends up pathologizing the parts of her character or her identity that it wants to, right? So the fact that she's a kind of a proper London girl never really comes into their matrix of thinking. She's somebody who exudes Londonness in so many ways, right? And just hearing her speak, you can kind of pick up the intonations and the gesticulations, which any of us who have grown up in London immediately recognize and say, "Oh, that's kind of one of our own." We know it, we see it, we recognize it immediately, whether you're Muslim or not, right? We see those cultural markers that make us, the neighborhoods from which we're from. In the same way that I can generally recognize a South Londoner from an East Londoner, like we have the ability to see that because these are the communities that we grew up in. And so you see when they talk about this whole idea of citizenship deprivation, they become obsessed with her behavior as opposed to, kind of where she comes from, so that they can try and exclude her. And I think one of the people who's probably done the best work, in my mind, on really tackling this whole thing head on is Azadeh Moaveni, who wrote a book, Guest House for Young Widows, where she goes through the stories of a lot of these, kind of ISIS, what are known as the ISIS widows. It's absolutely superb piece of work. She really gets to the heart of, how connected so many of these young women are to the countries that they hail from, whether it's Tunisia, whether it's London, whereas elsewhere. Somebody's just asking for the title. I'll type it out the next time I get a chance. But yeah, I think that that's part and parcel about the way that the law works, and we see this in other respects as well. You see it with cases to do with rape, for example. And I did my undergraduate dissertation on this, how the law specifically exists to exclude women's claims by virtue of an understanding of how it sees male behavior, okay, or how it sees female behavior in many ways. Actually, in the same way of Muslims, we see how our behaviors are pathologized in certain ways to exclude us from the law in particular. Sorry, that was a very long way of
no. Let it be long. Let it be as long as you want it to be.
I mean, our aim with this is not for it to be like a rapid fire. We want to get your genuine.
No, but I know Suhaiymah's got a lot of good kind of important views on Shamima Begum, like helped me think through a lot of her kind of difficulties as well.
Appreciate that, Asim. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add I guess two things. I think one is that a lot of, I think this has to be seen within a wider context as well of kind of the way that the border is weaponized against people of color. And I think if we situate Islamophobia within white supremacy, this is also about maintaining Britain's whiteness, right? And I think Nadine El-Anani actually just wrote a really good book called Bordering Britain, or not just a while ago. And but one of the things that she kind of, I think, really concisely gets across is that something that has kind of happened over the period of Britain kind of transitioning to calling itself or kind of proclaiming itself to be a nation as opposed to an empire is also this closing down on like who has access to the resources of Britain. And so through immigration legislation, you have this kind of racialization that you essentially say, we're gonna close citizenship down onto those who can prove that they have a parent born here, and they do it at a time where it's a very, very high chance you're going to be white if you fall within that. And over the years we see this obviously manifest in different ways, but I think thinking about Shamima Begum in that broader context, and also in the context where I think the year before that we had the Windrush scandal, and up until today we have like deportations that are going on. I think I also see this within that kind of when I saw lots of people, particularly people of color and Muslim people, condemning Shamima Begum and kind of saying, yes, she deserves to have citizenship stripped. This is rightful. I think one thing that I sensed there was we want to distance from us the possibility that this could happen to any of us. And I think the reality, because in reality, is that if you are not white in this country, your citizenship is precarious. So rather than sort of exceptionalizing this case or like saying, isn't this a violation of the way things should be, I would actually say this is kind of proof or reinforces actually what's possible for any of us. And I think that's quite important as well as sort of, thinking about the way that she does belong here, because of course she does, but I think it's the way that the state would like to frame it is that you can never belong, right? There's not enough belonging you can do because we're going to racialize that border and that access to those resources. And the second thing that I just wanted to say was that obviously, there was a real gendered narrative around Shamima specifically and kind of the outcry and, I think the simultaneous, victim and villain thing going on there. But one thing again that I found interesting is that we can connect this back again to the broader, I think, policing of Muslim women's bodies and Muslim women's identities. And I think that's because Muslim women or women in general have often been associated with the nation, right? That even if you look in cartoons in sort of like, the past 100, 200 years, it's always like a woman holding this flag, and that's very much like the image of the nation. But that's very much to do with the way that we think about the reproduction of nationhood, whether that's biologically or culturally, right? So how the woman, how the woman dresses, how the woman holds herself, the identity of the woman becomes also how we see the future of the nation progressing. And so I think it becomes really important for Muslim women to be policed then, because the British state doesn't want to imagine a future that's not white, but also that potentially is, so deviant from those secular norms and also that is associated with those norms we see to be violent. So Muslim women will inherently bring up problematic families, right? This is the idea. And so I also see Shamima within that. And I guess I just wanted to bring in those contexts of sort of the broader nation and the broader gendering of the nation. And I think, in many ways, I kind of feel like Shamima Begum at this point is is so unhuman to all of us, right? Like she crops up in conversation all the time as this motif, and in myself included. Like, I think I always try to remember, who is Shamima, right? Like, what food does she like? What books does she read? What did she used to watch as a child on TV? And I think that for me is also going back to what I think you were saying earlier about that kind of embodied Islamophobia as well, like when Shireen is kind of in that panel. And I think those moments are really important to remember as the really embodied realities of like, you just us, she's not anyone to us anymore, she's this motif. So yeah, I think that's quite painful as well.
I just want to make note that Baharat's internet connection cut out, so he will try to join us soon, inshallah. But related to something that you were just saying now, Suhaiymah, but you also wrote in your essay, is this idea of, how oftentimes we have to negotiate our humanity, right? That we have to negotiate the fact that, or we have to answer these like incessant questions, right? For women, it's why do we wear hijab? For men, it might be why do you grow a beard? Why do you pray? Why do you X, Y, Z? We constantly have to do, kind of answer these questions. And something that you write is how futile that often becomes, right? I think the entire theme of this book is like condemnation and kind of playing this game, entertaining these type of inquiries is futile. But I guess like conversely, I also wonder how futile it is to kind of turn these questions on their head, to kind of expose the xenophobia behind these questions. And this is something that you write in your essay, is that, if someone asks you about your hijab, or if someone asks you to condemn, you try to unpack why it is that they're asking you this question, right? What it says about them. Do you think that it's productive to do so? Do you find that you've actually made big breakthroughs in doing so? Because I think my experience has been those who are genuinely interested in hearing answers to these questions, right? Genuinely interested in trying to understand Muslims or Islam or the way, our community operates. They are looking for, without knowing it, an opportunity for dawah, right? If you give them an answer, they will genuinely take it and be like, hey, that's kind of neat. I respect that. I respect why you fast or why you pray, whatever. And those who are not satisfied with the questions will never be satisfied, regardless of whether you expose their xenophobia or their bigotry. And so I often find ourselves like, and this is true for myself as well, is that, we try to kind of score points in this way, right? That I'm going to expose their motivations, that I'm going to, turn this question on its head. And I'm not sure that it's the most productive use of our time versus just ignoring these type of inquiries, ignoring these type of, demands or asks that are made of us, and instead just focusing on building our own industries, building our own law firms, owning from top to bottom media or healthcare or tech or what have you. So I'm wondering like what your experience has been in that way. Do you find that it's productive to kind of engage in this like anti-condemnation, if you will?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and I think I definitely see where you're coming from. I think so. The first thing to say, I guess, is that context matters, right? So, like, you're absolutely right. Like, I'm not. It's not like every single person who asks me, I'm just like, I'm not. I refuse to answer. It's it's obviously very context dependent. But I suppose in the book we're talking about a specific context wherein I'm assuming this is a demand, and so I think with the do I think it's productive in any way, or it's kind of just like another form of condemnation? I feel like perhaps that's a misunderstanding of what I was trying to get across, which is more an idea that, for me, by asking that question, I'm not trying to score a point necessarily. I'm actually trying to reveal to both of us that in this context, in this conversation, there's something else going on. There's another dynamic. And I guess the way that I see it is, as a Muslim, like we're all witnessing things all the time. We're going to be witness to different things. And I kind of feel like a question. And I guess I preface this by saying I think it's very legitimate to ignore, and I actually think that might be very productive many times. But I also think in certain contexts, one, if I know that this is a question that's being witnessed, right? And I guess maybe I was thinking in the context of being like in panel events and talks, which I am quite often, where I'm engaging with these questions. For me, it's very important for other people to see, because there will be other people listening who, I guess that question is something they may have also wondered, right? But I think for me to expose that it is a demand, and that that it's coming from somewhere, what I see that as doing is denaturalizing, right? I think we often think the dynamics that exist are just very natural. And my hope in denaturalizing and showing this has a dynamic is that, you know, others of us who are witnessing can say, oh, there's a context here and there's something here. And other times I even think I just want to witness for myself, right? I want that to be kind of, it's kind of like no one else is going to stand up for me. I want to be the one who stands up for me. And sometimes ignoring can be really powerful, but I think sometimes ignoring personally can make me feel quite powerless, because it almost feels like I didn't get a voice. There was no autonomy. There was nothing from my side. But I equally agree, you know, other times it's like for my safety, I wouldn't respond, right? So I think productivity is another thing that's like an important question though, because what do we mean by productivity? Like, is it necessarily the case that if we ignore these questions, then we'll go and like build up our own industries and our health and law firms and stuff? And I don't think, like, I know for me, that's not the case. Like, if I ignore these questions, I'm not going to go and build like those things necessarily. And I think that's because it is also productive work to be in the work of kind of agitating and revealing this kind of violence. And that's because, as again, going back to that idea of we are witnessing. And I think, you know, that hadith about if you see something and you can't change it with your hand, you change it with your tongue. If you can't change your tongue, you change it with your heart. I guess I sort of feel it's like that as well. Like there's a record, and for the record, I want it to be known that somebody did sort of speak back to that. Somebody did sort of try to push back at that narrative. And I think in a broader look at life, right? I kind of think, what would it be to be productive as a Muslim in the world? And sometimes I wonder if, you know, we almost think that our end goal is to solve all the problems facing Muslims. Whereas for myself, perhaps like I kind of have come to a conclusion where it's that only Allah knows the end goal, right? Only Allah knows the kind of outcome, sorry. But our end goal is really to grow as close as we can to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is really our only goal. And so if on that journey, I struggle to aid others or to aid myself or to you know, in many different ways, I think that that's still productive. So it's not that I'm trying to like win something or that I'm trying to, I guess, I just think it's a different framework perhaps of thinking about what success or productivity can also look like. So yeah, but I definitely don't disagree with where you're coming from in the sense of like, I think context really does matter. But for me, I don't feel that it's futile. And I guess, I hope that maybe explains a little bit about why.
Yeah, I think it does. And actually something that you quote in your essay, and I just want to read it, is a quotation from Toni Morrison, who I love, you know, is a phenomenal writer. And she writes that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And I don't know, I feel like at one point in my life, I definitely would have agreed with what you've just said. But the point that I'm at right now, it feels like not just the function of racism, but a lot of like anti-racist work or anti-Islamophobic work does kind of serve this function of distraction, where continuously you're explaining your humanity to those who have very fixed worldviews, who are not going to budge from them, who are not going to benefit from your, you know, beautiful like explanations. And I'm not talking about you specifically here, I'm just speaking in general. And you know, that a lot of these conversations about identity and humanity and, you know, individual experiences with racism, they fall on deaf ears, right? They, regardless of how, you know, wonderful your diversity and inclusion seminar is, or your anti-racism, you know, literature is, it doesn't actually forward the Islamic worldview, if that makes sense. So I guess like at this stage, you know, I am a bit disillusioned about the productivity. And I know we disagree on, you know, this definition of productivity. I think like as, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creations were sent as stewards of his earth to build an earth that is beautiful, you know, that is safe, that is just, that is inclusive, that is, you know, all of these like wonderful attributes that we'd like. And I think sometimes we get distracted along the way. I don't know if Asim or Bahra, thank you for joining us again. You want to chip in?
No problem. Terribly sorry. I mean, I'm spending a little bit of time catching up, but from what you've said, I think from previous conversations we've had, I think I would be in agreement, especially on your point on the productivity, I suppose. But I wanted to know, I mean, as I've just jumped back in and from listening, whether Suhaiymah, you had anything to kind of add or
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think, to be honest, like I I'm a little bit I think I'm a little bit thrown actually by that, because so I quote Toni Morrison in there, obviously talking about the fact that very much I don't situate what I'm doing as explaining my humanity. It's in fact the very opposite of that. So I don't see that as the same thing. And I think I'm with you in the sense that lots of anti-racism work is co-opted entirely by capitalist logics and neoliberal logics. So equality, diversity, inclusion, even, decolonizing, all these buzzwords that we have, it's all to really satiate demands of capitalism so that it can just restructure and regurgitate and continue to kind of, extract all of our value for itself. But I wouldn't see that as a reason to not work against injustice, because I think I don't really I don't know, maybe this is because Allahu Alam, maybe it's because Allah's kind of puts people in different places for different roles. Like, I don't think we all have to do the exact same type of work. I actually think that's something really central. Something that I've learned over time is that there will be people doing work that I would never see myself doing, because it's just like that's something I can never vibe with. But you know what, Allahu Alam, they're going to be judged on what they've done and the position they were put in. So yeah, I guess I guess I'm a little bit surprised and a bit thrown by that, because I think I have never really thought that trying to resist injustice could be a kind of waste of time. I don't see it that way. And I guess that goes back to what Asim was saying about kind of oppression as something that we have to care about. And I don't really see it as a choice as well, but.
Right. I mean, I just want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that resisting injustice is a waste of time, but rather like the constant explanation of self, and also the explanation of why we won't explain ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't think. Okay, yeah, no, I hear you. I guess I just thought that is what I was saying in my chapter, but perhaps that isn't what you felt I was saying. So I think it's just a misunderstanding.
I think there's if you don't mind me chiming in a little bit, I think there's there were some points sort of in this area. I think, Asim, you maybe, well, I suppose I'd like to gauge your view as well, actually. The kind of attitude, I suppose, that many may have towards activism as a use of time, whether that be a healthy use of time or an unhealthy use of time as a community, or not. When I spoke to Imam very recently, we were talking about how Muslims do exceedingly well in a number of professions. For example, like in the States, in medicine, Muslims do seem to be dominating that scene. I know that in the UK, there are a number of Muslims in law, a number of Muslims in finance, but there can be a feeling of perhaps our place within those industries, or our place as figures within those industries, maybe not being as pronounced as they could be, especially where there seems to be so much interest and so much expertise. And I think, from a personal point of view, at least from a legal point of view, having met a number of barristers of chambers in Birmingham or London, who are especially good at what they do, whether that's a family practice or immigration practice, or even solicitors in areas of practice such as yourself, or crime, or what have you. Is there kind of a question there of us needing to kind of own these things a little bit more, and not that a constant pull towards activism would be a distraction or a waste of time per se, but don't you think there's also good to be found, at least on an individual level, within people's families, and for individuals as futures, to kind of own what they do, and for it to be more than okay to chase these kinds of ambitions?
Absolutely. We've got to start from the principle for this, which is ittaqillah mastata'tum, right? You fear Allah as much as you can. This is a central ethic that we've been given from the Quran, right, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that wherever space you are ever in, wherever space you occupy, wherever you are in the world, at any given place, at any given time, that taqwa that we're supposed to have, that we embody that in every single way that we can. Now, when we start off from that position, it doesn't matter where you are or what you're doing, right? It's about that personal relationship that you have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is representation the panacea to building political capital? Iman spoke about productivity, building institutions, moving forward together, right? It's not necessarily the case. And I don't want to equate the UK and the US. We've got two very, very different systems for many different reasons. The UK doesn't have the same system of slavery, Jim Crow, Black Civil Rights Movement, COINTELPRO coming into the modern era, right? We just don't have that explicit history in the same way. We have echoes of it, we have mutations of it, we have various other forms of it that, of course, need to be tackled, but not at that same level, not at the same hegemony that it had. And so when you look at, for example, the work of people like James Foreman Jr., right, whose work specifically looks at the Black role in producing a system of mass incarceration for Black people, we begin to see how the representation that we seek at a political level can, in long-term ways, have a negative repercussion for us as we build like a bourgeoisie class, okay, of those who, are producers, who are productive from a very secular materialist perspective, right? Because, we feel like, well, everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Why can't they be more like us? These criminals, these uneducated people, they're holding us back. And so we reinforce laws in order to maintain our own safety and security, but at the expense in the long term of others, And James Holman Jr. starts his book so amazingly because he talks about this moment in a Washington court where the judge is Black, the prosecutor is Black, the defense lawyer is Black, the bailiffs are Black, the police officers in the court are Black, but the sentence for the Black defendant is higher than it would be for a white defendant. This is the pinnacle, this is the peak of representation politics. Having every single person in the courtroom look exactly like you. Why is that judge giving a higher sentence than he normally might otherwise do? Why is he not taking it easy on this young Black man? And that's what the book, unpicks so well. He talks about other statistics, how 70% of Black police officers in Chicago had views towards Black people that were indistinguishable from the KKK. When they were actually polled about their own, interviewed about their views, right? So within these systems and these structures, you end up in this position where, seeking that representation, you have to then play a certain game, right? And that's where the taqwa comes in. Like a person of taqwa, okay, he is able or she is able to hold their own in all of these circumstances. They will know when to withdraw. But the problem is that when we tie success, ideas of success, to building material or political capital, the ability to find taqwa within that becomes reduced. And this is the problem with material success, that it's always presented in and of itself as being an ethic, that once material success is gained, with it comes X, Y, and Z. Whereas all four of us know from all of the friends that we have, right, in professional environments, that they are quite often the least ethical people that we know as well at the same time. That they're quite often the people who are willing to cut corners, the ones who are willing to kind of say, oh, when I'm older, I'll worry more about that, right? That narrative that we hear again and again and again. And so we get into this world where, we kind of sell this myth of halalifying our lives. So having a halal holiday, halal food, halal fashion, right? That this is this is the peak of our existence. Whereas all it is kind of Muslim neoliberalism. We actually reduce our ambitions, we reduce our desire for a more sane and just world, because what we've said is that as long as we can have everything that Westerners have, but have a halal version of it, we'll be happy, right?
Mhm.
But I'm not content with that. That's not what satisfaction of living in the dunya looks like for me personally. It's not something that I aspire to. It's not something that I want. I want to see an end of riba, for example. Like I have that aspiration for myself. And I remember speaking to a group of imams not too long ago. They were recent graduates from Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And we were talking to them about what it meant to be an imam. And one of the things that we asked them is like, what are the key issues that you think are a problem within the societies that you deal with? And they mentioned the usual stuff, kind of liberal values. Some of them mention LGBTQ rights. Others mention, kind of the war on terror, prevent, all of these things, right? So they mentioned a whole host of things as being the problems that they saw. I said, what's really interesting is that not one of you, not a single one of you mentioned that you live in a world where riba is the predominant form of finance that we see in the world, that it's ubiquitous. Like the money that we deal with every single day is based on a riba system. I said, I'm not saying that your job is to deal with that. I said, our job is to remember that it's important, that it has an impact, that it impacts upon our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be so unaware that our zakat is being paid through a system that ultimately is so violent and harmful, but our hearts are so dead to it that we don't even consider it in our daily lives. And so, my issue with this whole, kind of the way that these discussions are kind of formulated and phrased, is that because we lack such a poverty of ambition for what the world could look like, because we can't see past what it means to be productive in a material sense, we end up limiting our ambitions based on the way that the world looks like right now. So the idea that nothing other than citizenship according to a nation state could ever exist, right? It may never in our lifetime. Allahu Alam, I don't know, right? I do know that there's a promise from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that all of this will end, right? Regardless. But I don't think that my being split from the rest of my ummah based on a passport should be the way that I die, if I can do anything that I can to stop that from happening.
It reminds me of something. Sorry, no, go on, Iman.
No, go ahead.
No. Just a small tiny point. It reminded me of something I said to Iman yesterday. Actually, we were kind of wrapping up some prep for this, and it's the idea that I can't remember the quote exactly, the reference, but it's the idea that as Muslims, no matter where we are, regardless of where you're from or where you live, we're a nation as a whole. In a spiritual sense, in a physical sense. I think what you're referring to, Asim, is the need for the our ethics, but then also our own unique kind of spirituality within our faith to also be at the forefront of our minds when we think about building new structures for the world we would like to live in a sense. And I think that's a bit of an interesting frontier to think about and explore. I think I actually agree with the number you said as well.
Yeah, I just want to add that, I don't see the two as necessarily like mutually exclusive. I think that our material ambition, if you will, should not be to become some head executive of Goldman Sachs, or JP Morgan, but it should be to develop these like first principles based on Islamic ethics and then build institutions that reflect that grounding, right? That foundation. So the work needs to be spiritual first, right? The work needs to be internal first, and then it becomes external. And I think like in this regard, and I know some of the people who are, watching today witness some of the disagreement that you had with the clip of Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad on Twitter, and they were curious about what your thoughts are. I think this is where we see both of them working in tandem. I respect the work that both of you are doing, and his work is focused on developing that type of like spiritual community, a type of like spiritual resilience within the ummah, building these like spiritual institutions like he has at CMC, and then using that to work externally as well. So I think the work that you're describing is important as well. So. I just want to bring up that
people misunderstood
I think they did too. I think that's the nature of Twitter.
My disagreement with the Sheikh was really about his use of the word moan, which I found to be infantilizing and somewhat insulting towards those people who feel the violence of the state, right? When you say that it's moaning to go to a court, in order to gain your rights, even if it's a Brussels court, and that and there is something in there interesting about like how he privileges certain ideas of courts outside of the UK as opposed to those inside the UK as well, which is kind of another part of his thinking, which we don't really have the time to unpick in this discussion, but it's another interesting area that maybe needs to be thought about in more detail. But you know, really the main thing is, you know, and it comes back to what I was saying about having empathy and treating people based on their individual experiences. You know, when we use a word like moan for people who are finding difficulties in their life, what we're saying is that they don't have a legitimate concern about what they're going through. And that's what I took issue with. You know, look, the Sheikh, you know, obviously he's produced a great deal, you know, and he's, you know, so worthy of much of the accolades that he's being given, right? But at the end of the day, he doesn't have to look a mother who's had a child taken away from her and is fighting that in the high court behind secret evidence. He doesn't have to look her in the face and say, I think you're moaning by trying to get your child back. I have to look at her face, right? I have to engage with her. I have to be the one who stands there and says, we will do our best to support you in this endeavor, right? And so that's why I found it very condescending for him to speak like that about, forget about me, I don't care. Honestly, wallahi, you can say what you want about me. I do not mind one bit. Like, I'm nobody in the grand scheme of, you know, the people that Islam has produced in this world. And so therefore I have no rights. But the people who are deserving of our love, our respect, our sympathy and empathy are those who are suffering, you know. And you know, it reminds me of the ayah in Surah Nisa, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says literally, what is wrong with you that, you know, when you hear the cries of the men, women and children who are being oppressed, that you don't go out and fight for them? Okay, now, you know, obviously nobody is talking about, like, you know, committing acts of violence on the streets of London, but the very least that we can do when we hear the cry of the oppressed is to go and aid them, you know, bil amwal even, you know, like that's considered a secondary stage of those who struggle for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sake of Islam. But at least that is still a category of person that is praised for doing something at least, you know. And this comes back to, you know, how we understand what our duties and obligations are. It's really funny because people often say to me, you know, Jazakallah khair, brother Asim, you know, for you and your you know, the people at Cage, the brothers and sisters there, you're fulfilling, you know, sometimes they say you've fulfilled the fard al-kifaya upon us, right? Now, if you study any of the four schools of thought, you know, especially the Maliki school, Imam Malik, you know, having presented one of the first early iterations of what the fard al-kifaya is, right? It's that it's a sufficiency that has to be fulfilled. Otherwise, the sin exists on us all. We're none of us. This ummah is not free from this sin until the kifaya has been dealt with. Like, all of the ulama agreed on this. The fard remains al-ain until the matter is finished, right? We're not talking about carrying out the janazah here. We're talking about ending oppression. The two are not the same, you know, at all. Two, three people can complete the janazah easily, right? And it's done, alhamdulillah, right? But what about our prisoners? Our political prisoners? They, in many ways, represent the spiritual health of 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 our politics, right? Where we are, the extent to which we abandon them for the sake of self-preservation. You know, all of these oppressed people that we see around them. And I'm not saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to put us in hellfire for any of this. What I'm saying is that we should, especially those of us who have all of this risk being brought up in the West, like the idea that the risk of a farmer in Afghanistan is the same as us is a nonsense. You think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to ask him about what's going on in with the Uyghur, with the Muslims in Burma, with, you know, any of these places, in the same way that he's going to ask us? We might have it very, very fortunate in the sense of economically and intellectually and whatever else living in the West. But I also believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to come down much harder on us as well, based on the risk that we've been given. And so, like, again, long-winded way of talking about this, but, you know, we judge people who have $1 million or pounds worth of money for being bakhil in the way that they distribute that money, for being stingy. We don't judge Muslims who are being given $1 million worth of intellectual capital for being stingy with their time and their efforts and their energy, you know, in terms of redressing the problems that we see. And we're not talking about any of the people in this conversation. Like, mashallah, you guys are all you're all doing your best, even if we might disagree with one another, right? We have that thing where we're trying to link what we're doing to having taqwa of Allah, right? But the vast majority of Muslims are not like this, you know, unfortunately. Otherwise, we would be in a completely different position than we're in. The reality that we have to have these conversations is indicative of the fact that we are still so far behind where we need to be.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, you know, that this type of work needs to happen in tandem, right? That, you know, what you're saying about advocating for those who perhaps have less risk than us, that absolutely is a responsibility on those of us who might be in, you know, the Western part of the world and have more opportunity, right? More resources at our disposal to advocate for them. And I think this idea really hits on this theme throughout the entire book about power, right? And how people frame power, right? So I just want to mention like a few quotations that kind of jumped out to me. Remy Joseph Salisbury, in his essay, he wrote about how our role is to fight the power, dismantle unequal distribution of it, and challenge those who wield power over others. Tariq Yunus defined power as the intersection of capitalism and the military-industrial complex and nationalism. And then Cyrus Goldrick, he quoted Afia Siddiqui and said that Americans have no respect for people who are weak. Americans will respect us if we stand up and we are strong. And something that I've noticed as of late within our community is that we kind of share the sentiment that Remy is describing here, that any type of unequal power distribution is inherently wrong, right? That our role is to fight these power differentials, is to dismantle unequal distribution. And my question is it really our role to dismantle any type of power differential, or is it more productive? And I know that word is contentious now, productivity, but I hope you can assume the best in the way that I'm using it. Is it perhaps more beneficial for us to use that power, right, or that risk, or those resources, or those opportunities, however you want to define it, for means that are good for our community? Right, that advocate for people who are, you know, oppressed, who are on a, you know, under injustice. So, you know, this is just a sentiment that I see a lot in our community, is like this pseudo Marxist disdain for any type of power differential, that there needs to be a complete flattening of society, needs to be some type of like pseudo egalitarianism, which the West attempted and failed miserably at by design. So I'm just wondering, like, what your thoughts are on this. Like, are we doing enough to kind of seize power for our own ends, and should we be doing so?
Suhaiymah, do you want to say something first?
Yeah, and this is open for everyone. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think again for me, it's like a very context dependent question, because I think it's, you know, the example that I've been thinking about a lot recently is when Musa alayhi salam goes to the Pharaoh, you know, he doesn't say at any stage, can there be more Israelites in the administration perhaps? Could we just maybe have a bit more representation in the core? Or, you know, there's no notion of sort of, Allah doesn't even try to share in the power, try to share in the capital, and I'm not saying that should be like we should use that always at all times, but I think I've been trying to really seriously think about, you know, that really speaks to that question, I think, of can we ever, and when can we actually take, you know, the power dynamics of the systems that exist and use them? And I personally think in the West, that would be ethically very difficult for us, because if we know that all the institutions, or at least let's say many, you know, but are built on oppression of the global South generally, but also even just of people within our own societies, I don't know, for example, what it would look like to be able to disrupt that fundamental dynamic, because if it's underpinned by, you know, a labor division, or if it's underpinned by a real serious like resource differential, I'm not sure how that would work. And so I think when we're talking about like dismantling, I think, you know, that people aren't just talking about sort of like remove, you know, get rid of everything, but I think there's a real sense of like, what could an alternative look like, right? Like, are there alternative ways of organizing social relations where discrepancy is I think that word that I personally find her more interesting is justice and injustice, right? So like other ways of organizing social relations where you don't have to remove someone else's right in order to gain yours. And I think that's very much the premise of Western modernity, is like the only way I can have rights is if you don't, right? And so I personally, I guess, and again, this is like without any specific examples, but I veer towards feeling like I don't really know how that would work, which is why I'm kind of very uncomfortable with the notion. And I haven't seen any good practice examples, you know what I mean? Like I can't think of an example where historically or presently, power has been captured by those who, have good intentions. But maybe that's also the fundamental nature of power, right? Like Allah also warns us that power does corrupt, right? Like I don't know if power can, if maybe that is the nature of different nafses and different human beings, and maybe it's also a kind of really individual thing, and maybe there is a way that other people, in the right kind of, I don't know, but I just feel like in the world that I know and see, in the West that I know and see, yeah, Allahu Alam, but my instinct is that I don't see how that would work.
I mean, doesn't this come back to like what we've been saying about risk? We know that each one of us has a very, very specific amount of risk that we're going to receive in our lives, right? So we already know that that's been one of the things that is set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's never going to produce necessarily equality, egalitarianism in a material sense, necessarily. We don't know that as a matter of fact. All we know is that whatever it is, it's been set, right? And the point about what's been set is that you get to choose what to do with it, right? You get to choose how to behave. And so then we go back to the first generation, right? Because, I mean, really, as always, they give us a pathway for everything else in our lives. So the Prophet ﷺ, the person who gave more than anyone else, the one who sacrificed more than anyone else. You of course have the stories of Umar ibn al-Khattab and Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, this, the ultimate sabiqun, right? If you wanted to really summarize who the sabiqun are, it's that hadith about them bringing the charity and Umar coming with this huge pile and seeing Abu Bakr with nothing, and then how that's quantified, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala quantifies that between the two, right? Like it's just these amazing moments. And you have Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who'd been given a huge amount of risk, but gave even more. Like he just couldn't give it away fast enough. That's how much risk that he had. Uthman ibn Affan, right? Like we have all of these examples of these people who are given this massive amount of risk, but the difference between them and us now is that we believe that we are the producers of that risk. That is the difference. They knew fundamentally that nothing that they did produced the wealth that they had, that it was something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala determined for them. And that's why, when we talk about how we distribute our wealth, how we try and pull up others, how we try and make society more equal in as many ways as we can, it's because the overriding ideology of our time is capitalism. Like there is nothing that is as ubiquitous throughout the whole world in terms of an ideological phenomenon as capitalism is, because it is in every single state that there is, in every single Muslim country, in every single Muslim company, right? This has a predominant place, which is why obviously, kind of some people turn to Marxist critiques. Marx is a great critique of capitalism, without a doubt. It's a great critique. He's light on solutions, okay? I don't agree with his own solutions, right? In terms of, how we build, because he doesn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He doesn't understand risk. He doesn't understand who the producer of the wealth is in the first place, right? But I'm not going to blame an atheist for not understanding Islam. His critique of capitalism, as far as I'm concerned, is great. Now, how do we understand our responsibility? We understand it, I believe, in the same way as Umar radiallahu understood it. When people were dying in the famine, right? What does he survive on? He survives on bread and vinegar, okay? And people were like, he was emaciated, by the end of this, literally the Khalifa of Islam was skin and bones by the end of the drought period, because he refused to eat anything that his ummah wasn't able to survive on, right? Now, and so we talk about building Muslim leadership. We talk about building Muslim capital, political capital, all of these different types of capital. We talk about all of this stuff, right? But we don't inject in it this idea of sacrifice for the sake of the ummah, right? Even in terms of how we buy brands. You know that you both, all of you know the hadith about the man who makes dua, okay, in the desert. He's a musafir, he's in the desert, he's alone, right? And this is one of the categories of people whose dua is always accepted. But what does Allah say about this person? That how will his dua be accepted when his food is haram, when his drink is haram, and when the clothes that he is wearing are haram? So we know about halal food and drink, very easy. But we also constantly buy clothes that are made by companies that rely upon forced labor, on coerced labor. The lives that we live in the West are built off the back of third world labor. Everything that we enjoy in the West, almost everything, is built off the back of third world labor, right? And so we get into this strange situation where you have these new imams coming along and saying, zakah and sadaqah, it's only for the local community. It's only for the local people. We should stop sending money abroad. You live in a neoliberal system which requires free trade agreements in order to produce cheap products that you are privileged to wear and use and type on and whatever else in the West. And you want to start talking about how we shouldn't be sending money back home when you live in a neoliberal economy? I mean, it's ridiculous that we've reduced ourselves to these very, very strange localized understandings of Islam, which reinforce these ideas of like citizenship, of privileging certain people over others, of privileging certain societies over others, because we forgot that ultimately we are an ummah, and that is part of the problem that we have, that we forget that we are supposed to feel angry and upset and hurt at the pain of others who we can't see. Like Umar radiallahu anhu did. He couldn't see others, but he still felt their pain in a very visceral way. And because we don't sacrifice, because we don't pay attention, and because our hearts are closed to their suffering, we end up unfortunately privileging ourselves in the lives that we live. And I'm a chief offender of this myself, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows me to live up to some of these words that I'm saying. I pray that we don't become hypocrites as we speak and pontificate about this,
Mm-hmm.
and can actually carry it through as well. But these are important things for us to think about and consider, and I feel sometimes we let ourselves down in that regard.
Can I add to that as well? Sorry, or were you going to come in?
No, not at all.
Are sure?
Please do. I'm perfectly sure. Yeah.
Okay. I think Asim, yeah, what you said obviously is just really helpful. And I just wanted to add, I guess there was a conversation I had a while ago, kind of during the Black Lives Matter uprisings, and I was having a conversation with two imams who are graduates of Medina University, and I was sort of discussing, I suppose, from a very, it was like a raw moment, right? I was like, really like, what do we do? I know it's doing enough. And something that really I found really, I guess, helpful and grounding for me was also remembering that one of the reactions that they had was, I guess, we often think, I suppose, that, we have these conversations, right, about like, should we be using these systems? Should we not? Like, what should we and shouldn't we be doing? But perhaps sometimes we're a little bit ahead of ourselves in the sense that, are we even spiritually, emotionally, politically mature enough to try to like wrest any power dynamics in the first place, right? And I guess when we think about justice as Muslims, the justice that exists for us, there's also the internal justice, right? Like, are you being just to your own soul? And that we know we can oppress our own souls, right? We know this is something you can actually do in Islam, and you can be held to account for the oppression of your own soul. And I think if we only consider like this external world, which I know none of us are, but I think that it's easy for that kind of thinking, I think, maybe to also influence us. And I think I'm guilty of this all the time, right? Like, I want things to change really on the external level all the time. But I think there's also a level of, what would it look like for us to be ready to do that? And also, is there an arrogance in assuming that we are even, of the generation that will do that, can do that? I don't think that takes away from the fact that we should always be struggling for justice, but I think there's that like balance, right? And you know, for me, that was just quite a good grounding reminder that, okay, well, what would the, you know, so, okay, say we're imagining like, you know, we're thinking of like, you know, the Sahaba at the time of Badr. We're thinking like, these are who we are, and we're going to take on these institutions and we're going to make them. But that's, we're not even like, we can't even name them in our own, you know, sentence with our own names. And I think that's, yeah, it just kind of, for me, also kind of grounds me then in, you know, what are we neglecting also sometimes? And I know we've talked a lot throughout this about like lots of things are not mutually exclusive, and I you know, trying to position this there, but at the same time, I suppose something that also came up in that conversation that was interesting to me was that those early Sahaba who we so kind of love and revere and praise, they also experienced probably the worst persecution that we you know, beyond what we're talking now. Like this was just, and they just had to put up with it, right? It was just like, you're just going to have to be here, be boycotted, be tortured. Like it's just, you don't really have another choice. And I also wonder like about our measurement of persecution, I suppose, as well. Not, sorry, let me rephrase that. I also wonder about perhaps, yeah, maybe the impatience that we also have about kind of using the measurements of this world. So I think all of that can be in tandem with also striving to struggle to change the world for those people that we are, because but the thing is, the difference, the other big difference is that we're complicit, as Asim's saying, we're constantly complicit in oppression. And so, yeah, I just think, I just wanted to add that, I guess, that maybe there's a question of also like, are we even at a stage where we can talk about whether we could or couldn't use the power dynamics that exist to our advantage? And I personally don't know if we're even, you know, sometimes we have such really, you know, really serious and technical conversations about, you know, really small matters that may be to do with, you know, like how someone is praying Salah, for example. And I don't think that's like, you know, irrelevant, but I think as Asim was kind of alluding to, we don't have these kinds of serious conversations about, for example, you know, what is the detriment or what is the complicity of, e.g., paying taxes, right? This is something Hoda Katabi, another of the authors, talks about in a really interesting way that really strikes me is, you know, would the Sahaba have paid their taxes in the US when this money goes to the military, when this money goes to, you know, incarcerating people and ICE and all these kinds of things? And I just think these provocations are important because I think we sometimes think as if we're the best of the ummah and we can really like do something, but are we even, you know, are we even using their standards to really think about the world? So that's really a provocation more for myself than any of you guys, but it's just something that I'm sort of thinking about in tandem with this.
I think something I was thinking about as you were speaking, Suhaiymah, and also Asim actually, is I think where I may disagree with you both isn't really in the substance, but I think it's more to do with perspective. I think there's a risk of us thinking that perhaps maybe we certainly will never be as great as the generation being referred to first. We never will be. It's a goal that's, yeah, it's just not attainable. But I don't think we should ever let that detract from us being able to constructively build, let's say, for example, the institutions or you know, family lives or communities that are even more cohesive than they are now, or even wealth to some extent, engaging.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing at all. I agree with you.
No, I know, me neither.
That's where the aspiration is.
You know, I think if we fall into a kind of a negativistic way of thought, especially with this perspective on such a serious range of matters, it can lead to an inertia. I personally feel, and I think there's a lot of people in the community globally that are suffering from an inertia as a result of a range of things, obviously, but mostly to do with looking forwards, I suppose. And maybe there is truth in the thought that we will never be as great as the first generations. But I think seeing as we have so much knowledge of their example, seeing as we can, with these fresh perspectives that we have, even with a grain of humanity in your heart, if you've been given even that, to become the person you are, I suppose, in my thinking, the person you're meant to be within your community, within your family, your profession, wherever you are, whatever you do. As long as you can realize that and feel as though you're supported in a sense, communally and personally, toward realizing that, I think that is an incredibly important foundation to kind of start a lot of these discussions from. Because
I'm sorry if you didn't get that from what I was saying, but yeah, I heartily agree. That's
this is just sort of general pontification,
right?
You know, it's, So for example, I was reading well, not with you now. It's something I've read before. We spoke about it. It's a commentary Ibn Khaldun made. He observed it a long time ago, and it was just sort of on this idea of people that are oppressed or humiliated developing character over generations that are either meek or developing characteristics that are even deceptive, for example. And that's why he warns against parents, for example, physically abusing children at extreme and stuff like that. And he did that very, very early on. That's incredibly important, obviously. But the kind of thought Iman and I had was, are Western Muslims somewhat uncritically adopting language that might not be in line with our ethics, like social justice language, viewing themselves preemptively almost as humiliated, perhaps in the extreme, that kind of leads to a further self-humiliation that kind of negates our self-agency in a way. Because I personally do feel that in a not for all people, but certainly when it comes to our socio-political thinking, how we imagine what a world could look like that involves us, because it will involve us as a nation, as individuals. I kind of wanted to know your thoughts on that. I suppose maybe this is something we could finish on as well.
Yeah, sorry, were you talking to Iman, or were you saying that last,
To
was anyone? Yeah, sorry, yeah. No, I heard you say Iman, so I was like, oh.
Yeah.
I heard your name, so I was like, she's gonna speak.
So it's interesting because when I was hearing you talk, one of the biggest critiques that I feel like people like myself, and potentially Asim, and feel free to disagree, Asim, get is actually that we're profoundly hopeful, that we're too hopeful, in fact, that we kind of have this vision of like an alternative future that is just unreasonable, right? It's like, you're never going to be able to actually change the world. That's ridiculous, let go of that. And so it's actually really interesting to kind of hear your reflection there, because I guess that's not really, that's just sort of something that I haven't experienced before. But I think I definitely agree with you about what you were saying at the beginning, that there is a kind of, beyond apathy, I think there's a real sense of like, there's nothing we can do, right? Like fatalism, like a kind of like, this is just the state of things, and like, Allahu alam, it's up to Allah. And obviously, Allah has said, I don't change the conditions of people until they change it for themselves, right? And we must take action, and we're a people of action, and Muslim is a practice. It's like, you can't just be Muslim, for silently on your own. It's something where you have to be a social creature. You have to give to people, you have to do for people, you're judged on those relationships. And so I think by virtue of that, there is a real, I suppose, argument to not be fatalistic, right? You kind of have to, it's almost that, you take your fate into your own hands, right? Like this is the job of us. And I think that's why we're all having this conversation, right? We're all people, I think, who believe that to a big degree. I think the second thing that you were saying, which now has just escaped my mind, but I wanted to speak to, I think so I haven't read this what you were talking about, but I guess I also feel that sometimes. So I think there's two things. I think that this kind of critique that Muslims are perhaps too meek, or too like oppression has kind of, I don't know, made us just like afraid to do anything, or like we're just talking about our oppression all the time. This kind of frustrates me, because I think it goes back to what Asma was saying about trauma at the beginning. Like I think often we don't really think about the actual impact that trauma has had. And I'm saying this as somebody who's like frustrated by people who aren't taking action, right? But I also want to extend a kind of radical empathy there and say, like, as Muslims, we're supposed to be merciful towards one another. We're supposed to try to really like encompass an understanding of the other. And I do a lot of work with children, that kind of school age and high school age. And something that I notice is like, you can see already the impact of racism and fear in the UK specifically, perhaps, but you can really see the kind of impact it has on kids, and their unwillingness to say certain things, their unwillingness to really question a status quo. And I think that really comes from nothing more, contentious than an instinct to survive. I think for a lot of people, it's a need to survive, is to just keep your head down, get on with things. Now, personally, I feel like as Muslims, we kind of have to be braver than that, right? We can't really, like, we kind of have to believe that our survival is less important than our kind of judgment on the day of judgment. But I also think that that's a journey, and I don't think we can impose that on, when I meet these 12-year-old kids, I want to be able to do both things and say, you know, I see you and I feel and I understand your pain, and I can understand why that makes you want to respond to the world in this way where, you know, you just want to focus on doing well in your school exams, you want to get into a good career, and you don't want to think about trying to change, you know, forget changing the world, you know, you don't want to change the ummah, you don't want to change the local mosque, and why should, you know, I can understand that. At the same time, I think we have to have, I just think with a lot of guess of what we said today, I think we're all kind of on the same page that I think multiple things need to be held in the mind at the same time. And it's really possible, you know, as Muslims, it's really possible to do that, to say this can be true. At the same time, I really believe it's the responsibility of those of us who feel that we can have kind of maybe been through that experience or moved through those feelings to also say to those same children, right? You know, I see you, I feel you. Also, you know, that fear you feel, there is something that we are less afraid of this than we are of Allah, right? Like, and trying to reposition that. And I kind of think, you know, maybe this goes back to what you were saying, Iman, the conversation we were having about my chapter. I think maybe sometimes I have maybe too much optimism almost in the hope that actually through human interaction and those very minute conversations and those sharing of you know, sitting down with a child like in a workshop who you may never see them again, you may never meet them again, you don't know their family, you don't know their context, but that there is something profoundly miraculous about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has only granted to human beings the ability to have those moments of communication and connection. And maybe I'm saying this as a poet, but I've seen the impact that it has, and that you can both extend empathy and provoke people to do more in the same sentence, right? And I kind of think that that's not impossible and it's not difficult, but I think what you're saying and this kind of inertia that exists, it's also cannot be kind of changed by us just sort of condemning those who are in that position, right? I think, and I add caveats because I guess there are people who are in very like responsible positions of institutional authority who have that position, and I think that's much more dangerous and harmful. But when we're talking about like the majority, particularly in Britain, of Muslims who are generally living majority in poverty, you know, the majority of Muslims in the UK live in poverty, and who are, you know, experiencing, a lot of them just recently, maybe refugees, asylum seekers, these systems of bureaucracy they have to deal with. And these, again, are survival things. I also kind of have to think about what Asim was saying about my risk, right? I'm a citizen, I'm third generation, you know, I've been to a good university, I speak English in the way that I speak it, all these things. It's like, I think my responsibility is to kind of show that perhaps through, if I can be slightly braver than I was last year, perhaps that can show to others that we are able to do that. And so, yeah, I just feel that, I guess this is, you know, this is that optimism that I'm talking about. I feel that it is possible, it really is possible to change those things. And I think also that maybe it's not within our lifetime, right? Maybe it is you know, the nature of the ummah today that we were in this sort of situation that we're in. But inshallah, you know, through just giving the example that we perhaps would have, I think a lot of the work I do is based on providing the kind of example I wish that I had a few years ago. And, you know, inshallah, that will be 5 years' time, I'll be like, gosh, I need to give her an example of what to be like, right? She's got it all wrong. But that's the hope. And I think that's how we grow and that's how we change. And again, I just think it does come down to that human, the heart in us, right? The rahmah and that instinct to love and care. And sometimes I think we forget that, you know, Islam is also so much about love. It's so much about you have faith in people even when they don't have it in themselves. Khadija radiallahu anha, she has faith in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam before he even validates his own experience. You know, I saw this, you know, did this, of course, Allah is talking to you. Yes, this did happen. I kind of think there's something so radical about that act of love that we sometimes lose it perhaps in the detail, in the kind of, you know, how and what and where. But when you have those interactions, and I don't know, I've been centering children a lot in the thinking that I've been doing recently. And I just think if we can't learn something from our interactions with children, which are perhaps the most merciful kind of creatures that we come across in this earth, then, you know, what are we doing? And so for me, it's that we can hold multiple things at the same time, and having radical hope, I suppose, which I believe is Islam, right? Having that hope, it is kind of incumbent upon us to believe that with Allah's, you know, power, anything is possible.
Asim, did you want to add something? And we're just going to wrap up right after.
Yeah, I just want to say that,
Okay.
you know, Jazakallah khairan for this. It's really helpful. But I just want to tackle your the point that you made about the kind of terminology that we use, right? We are in many ways subject to postmodernism in a way that's quite deeply traumatic and problematic in many ways. But I think that's partly because, since the invention of the nation state, we haven't adequately dealt with this idea of who we are beholden to. And because the state centers itself so heavily in our lives as the primary way in which we construct ourselves and our ideas of allegiance and loyalty, that where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is supposed to exist, the state exists instead. And so with that comes all the trappings of postmodernity as well. So it's not even a case that the problem itself is in with the language that many of our activists are unfortunately using, or constructs and whatever. It's because Islamic scholarship hasn't adequately dealt with this deeply traumatic idea that that ta'abbud is only in its uluhiyya towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at the same time somehow you have a responsibility towards a state, no matter how violent and egregious it might be. And because our scholars never taught us adequately how to deal with this dichotomy that exists in our heart between the two, you find people then going towards ideas and theories that will inevitably produce frictions within our communities, because the vast majority of scholarship preaches quietism. Salafis, from Saudi Arabia to Kuwait to UAE, whatever, they're all preaching quietism. Sufis have preached quietism for far too long, and between them, we've been trapped in this place where we have consistently been kind of almost gaslighted, to use a woke term, in order to feel like we're the ones who are have a problem in our hearts because of the way that we deal with the violence of the state. Whereas I would suggest that actually we need much more Islamic scholarship that is brave, that is true, that is courageous, that is able to deal with this dissidence that we're constantly being subjected to, because we have never truly taught that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our obligations to Him are paramount, even above our citizenship. So I'll leave that as my final words, inshallah.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. So I guess like one of the things that, I hope that people who are watching leave with, and feel free to correct me, is that, it is possible for us to disagree passionately, but with empathy, right, towards the same goal, and to hold multiple things, that are seemingly mutually exclusive, but need not be, right? That we can, like Suhaiymah, you were saying, have radical empathy for those who are facing injustice. And then also be wary of internalizing that humiliation and internalizing some type of meekness and weakness that is foreign to us, that should be foreign to us. And so using that as a motivation to build and to go forward and to advocate, I think, and I pray that, all of us are able to embody that, right? And are not just pontificating or speaking about it, but are also living it. And I know, mashallah, everyone here is actually living it. I mean, you guys do wonderful work. So I just want to thank you all for joining us. We are way over time, but I think there were so many things that Baharat and I wanted to get through. We only got through like half of our questions, but clearly this is such an important and big topic that, these conversations can continue, inshallah, in other forums or in other pieces of work as well. So on behalf of everyone at Traversing Tradition, I just want to thank you guys again, Jazakallah khair, for joining us on a Saturday evening. And I pray that all of you stay safe and protected and healthy and well, inshallah. So I'm just going to end the meeting.
All right. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.